Welcome to episode 126, The Rising Role of AI in Translation Workflows. So this is fun. We actually had a viewer comment, and of course it was from Marwa Mohammed and said, hey, congratulations on this amazing milestone, inspiring to see Translation Confidential making such a global impact. Just had a suggestion and saying that, hey, it'd be fun if you explored topics like the evolving role of AI in translation workflows or strategies for multilingual content localization in niche markets. Looking forward to more insightful episodes. Okay, yes, very kind comment. I feel like, Patrick, AI might have been like tattooed on our foreheads last year. I think we talked a lot about it, and so has the world. But hey, we're going to roll into it. We'll do it. But I think before we do that, you've got a news story or something.
Yes, not translation related this time, but baseball
But
season
still
is
very important.
exactly. Yeah, baseball season's right around the corner. And for those who don't know, Peter and I are both pretty big Cubs fans. So some Cubs news coming out is that they just released a new alternate uniform for the 2025 season. So very exciting. I particularly was not a fan of their old City Connect uniform, which is going away and being replaced with this one, but this one looks way cooler. We'll drop a link when we ship the episode out, but it's a nice baby blue throwback to the 70s and 80s road uniforms. So very excited to see a cool retro plus modern alternate uniform this year.
Yeah, excited to see what the Cubbies do. It's crazy to think that we're thinking about baseball again. We still have a bunch of football to go, but baseball soon right around the corner, I guess. So, all right, well, let's roll in. So, okay, so where should we start with AI and this idea of niche markets? And I mean, I think in my mind, Patrick, if we were looking at the whole, like, hey, what did AI do last year in translation? If we were to look at that, I think that's where maybe there's some inroads, right? And sort of some of these like very niche, very specific use cases. I think everybody wants to talk about, what's sexy. And what's sexy is like, oh, I upload a file and then, hey, minutes later I have a translation. Sure, that's the sexy part. But what I'll tell you where the real work is being done is I think in these niche markets. And I don't know, maybe we start with like transcription or something, Patrick. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean that's something we obviously run into a lot in the translation space. If a client will send a video and say, "Hey, I want the subtitles in a different language," and usually the project manager goes, "Great, do you have the script? Do we need to generate a transcript for you? Can you walk me through all of that?" So I would say 80% of the time they're like, "Yeah, we don't have a script. Go ahead and generate that for me." So that is a service a lot of translation and language companies offer is transcription. So I think that is an awesome use case of AI. Honestly, I think any video conference tool nowadays has a button that says transcribe, and that's most certainly AI doing that for you because it spits out that transcript about 5 seconds after your meeting is done. So it's going live, it's transcribing during the meeting. It's something I use now as a project manager just for notes for status meetings with clients. We'll record it, grab the transcript, and it's all very easy. I think similar to kind of the translation workflow you mentioned, though, usually they're not perfect when they're output from AI. There's some stuff to clean up. People's names I've noticed are typically butchered when they go through AI, or company names and things like that that aren't common language. So it definitely needs a sweep if you are going to put that transcript out anywhere to kind of catch those things that AI hasn't quite nailed yet.
Yeah, for sure. Acronyms, you name it, anything that's quite specific still requires a human in the loop, which is sort of the moral of the story of most of these things that we talk about, that, it just depends where you set the bar, right? So if the bar is low, well, then AI without intervention is sometimes okay. I mean, it's
Right.
just
That's
where you
for
set the
my
bar.
note taking purposes for meetings. It's fine. Like I know people's names, so I can easily pull out action items and things like that. But just to give me, I can then, funny enough, run that full AI transcription through AI again and say, okay, give me the action items, give me the due dates, give me all this stuff that we talked about. So I don't have to go hunting through my notes necessarily. I can just say, hey, give me the cliff notes of this transcription I just had you do.
Yeah, and that's a great use, right? So I think, transcription, you're going to see more and more. like you say, we're already seeing it a lot, whether it's if you're in Teams and you're running Copilot and you're asking it to do that, or pretty much whatever tool you're using. And there's tons of tools out there to different degrees, tools like Happy Scribe and such that'll create a transcription, time code it. And then, of course, there's services that, will also do that, use AI with a human in the loop. And, certainly something that we do as well. But I think it brings us to the next bullet point too, which is source cleanup, which I think is a really interesting use case as well, where you brought up an example, right? So I have a meeting, I do a transcription, I use another AI engine to say, do something with this data, create slides out of it, summarize it. So those are really, really neat use cases as well, and I think they're really strong for business. In terms of translation, where we've seen that is, one of the things that we talk about as translation providers is garbage in, garbage out, right? So if let's say you had a pretty sloppy transcription, or if you had you're doing a document and it was full of errors, that would be another case for UI where you could say, hey, could you clean up the grammar? Could you clean up any errors that you see? Another use of AI.
Yeah, I think another cool thing too is before you can make it part of your workflow as the buyer to run your document through AI and say, hey, am I consistent with the last document I sent?
Yes.
Again, we talk about how important translation memory is, and I'm sure we'll get there a bit later in the show. But if you're running that consistency check on your source material, it's going to make your translation that much easier down the road.
Yeah, absolutely. There's kind of a big idea floating around on translation memory. I think we'll hit that under the MT training. We'll talk about TM because there's really three buckets, right? And I was trying to explain this to someone in our group who, isn't really involved in operations, and the three buckets being translation memory, AI, or a large language model, and machine translation. And they're very distinct things, but you're seeing the lines blur. So we can talk a little bit about that through there, and that bullet point, I should say. But text recognition, I think, is another really, really good one. And we just recently, added the text recognition ability to that Slack chat tool that we have, which is really a neat thing. We did that as a client request. They're saying, hey, what if I put screenshots of error messages that aren't in my language? What can I do? And really cool, we're using a large language model to recognize the text that's in the image, create a string, and then use an MT engine that's been trained to handle that translation. So kind of using, multiple segments or multiple pieces of AI to do that. And it does that all within, it's about 20 seconds, which that's not terrible, all things considered, because, you're not packaging that up, sending that to a translation provider. It's all sort of happening in real time.
Yeah, I can't remember how many times we got either a locked PDF or just a huge bucket of screenshots from a client. They said, hey, can you go do this? And the old way of doing that is great. Find an intern or a junior project manager and say, hey, I need this all typed out. Can you go work on that for me? And I'll circle back with you in a few hours. And now you can dump it straight into an engine and say, hey, give me the text in this format. And then, like you said, you can either put in an AI workflow to translate or dump that out into a document, have it human translated, however you want to do it. But I think these kind of first 3 points, like we said, we're kind of zooming out of the translation workflow itself and kind of thinking about all of the wider things that go into a translation. Like you said, if someone just sends a video and they're like, hey, I want this translated, it can help us kind of get over some of the administrative and setup work to then actually focus our time on the translation itself.
Absolutely, Patrick. I mean, for me, one of the things that I've been telling folks is that I think the days of selling translation are gone. And if they're not gone, they're almost gone. And I realize people are, wait, what? It's a business solution, right? Because what happens is the text that requires localization or translation lives in all sorts of crazy places, right? Whether you're talking about a SharePoint repository, or whether you're talking about a website, or whether you're talking about in a set of 1,000 images that are screenshots, or whatever the case is. So I think those of us that are in the industry need to open our minds and say we have to be enablers of the process, right? So we have to be able to uh, reach into a client's process and help facilitate the translation. And I think agency owners that aren't thinking in those terms likely won't be here in 5 to 10 years. They just won't be here.
Yeah, I mean, I remember going through some of these things and thinking like, man, there has to be an easier, faster, or better way to do some of these things. And I think we're seeing a lot of people figuring those out and saving themselves a lot of time and energy to again, like you said, focus on what they do best, which may be the translation process, even if that's not necessarily the problem they're going to solve for the client. I think solving your client's problems is always gonna help.
100%, right? If you can facilitate, you're taking that problem off of their hands. Oh my gosh, right? And I know that for the clients that we've done similar things, you know, it changes things dramatically for what they need to do and what mission they need to get accomplished. I mean, speaking from a business perspective, it creates a level of stickiness that's tough to beat as well. So um, along those same lines, Patrick, glossary creation is another one. I mean, we've had some tools like this around, but I think now in using a large language model, you can go even deeper, right? I know that one of the things that the tool that Angelo Pasalacqua and Brian Monpetit were
Brian.
trying to create with Gabby T, right, was one of the things. So one of the early tools that was out there, they were saying, hey, look at this body of text, extract, the 100 most important terms, and then give me a translation and a definition of each of those in these three languages. I mean, that's pretty darn cool, right? I mean, the question becomes is how smart is the model to determine which are the 100 best terms. But so, you're going to need some intervention, but really, really cool use of a language model.
Yeah, I mean, I remember the tools. I think we used one in college that was similar at the time of it would run the analysis, but it would take a few minutes to get through a document. It would spit out all the kind of filler words that yes need to be translated, but aren't the important vocabulary words that need to be translated.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, like you mentioned, kind of with prompting, that you can kind of pour rocket fuel on some of those existing glossary tools and really elevate them to, again, save you lots of time and energy. I mean, I'm thinking back to college too, where so you'd use the glossary creator or tool to identify all the terms. Then you dump them into a term base. Then they would put all the definitions in the term base. Then they would translate them. Like, it was a 4 or 5 step process, and now it's all one thing that you can do with a pretty elementary prompt, and any AI tool should likely be able to output something pretty cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Huge time saver. Um, the next one to talk about is, machine translation training. And I recently saw, and we're gonna ask. I think we're gonna ask Heather to be a guest on the show. Heather Schumacher from Language IO had a post out which I thought was really interesting, and she was trying to draw the distinction between people that just blindly use machine translation and those that use trained engines. And I think that point is right on the nose. And I think for those that aren't aware of the different technologies, I talked about those three buckets. So let's just spend a quick minute. We could spend a whole episode, but let's spend a quick minute talking about those three buckets, right? So you can get translation from a large language model. In other words, something like an OpenAI. You can say, hey, here's this content. I need it in French. Great. So how does that work? Again, we could spend a whole 7 episodes talking how a large language model works, but understand the large language model in a nutshell is just trying to predict what the next word is in a sentence, word by word by word by word by word. And there's a lot of science behind how it does that, but it's not necessarily relying on version control, which would be what the last version was. It's not relying on that. That's translation memory. Translation memory, plain and simple, is a database. The last time I did this translation of this sentence, I used this. It's just a relational database. I've got this sentence. and here's the translation in however many languages. So that's translation memory. So that's more like version control. Then the last piece, however, though, is I don't, maybe saying a combination of those things isn't exactly correct, but what it is it's a machine translation engine that says I can look at a sentence in a given language and produce another sentence using language rules, using all the science that each of the engines, and they all do it a little bit differently in terms of Azure, DeepL, uh, Hugging Face, all the different models that are out there for machine translation. So, but what you can do is you can train an engine, and our favorite tool for that is Azure, and that's where you say, hey, in my translation memory, the relational database that we talked about, I have 100,000 segments of really good, clean, human verified translation. You upload it into Azure, and now you have a trained engine. And the way that that world measures quality is through something called a Blue score. And by doing that, you can raise the quality of the output
significantly.
Significantly. It depends on what you're doing, but what we've seen typically is 20 to 30 points improvement. High 50s for a bunch of this, like the FIGs, French, Italian, German, Spanish, languages that, EU languages and such. You can take it up 20, 30 points. So that's pretty darn amazing. Those are the 3 different buckets and approaches. One of the radical ideas, well, I don't know if it's radical. That's kind of one of the ideas that's floating around is saying, do we really need translation memory anymore? Is it simply that we use either a large language model or some form of machine translation? And I would say it's a little premature to call for the death of translation memory.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can see how powerful each of those are on their own, which is the first 2 buckets you went through. But then, like you said, I think it's pretty staggering how powerful that is when you marry those 2 buckets together and say, okay, don't just pick one, like let's use the best of both worlds. So to me, that seems like the jackpot is like, I think companies with tons and tons of historical segments and translations and translation memories being able to pour that on top of a large language model, that could be $1 billion idea of if you execute it well. Like that is enormous.
Absolutely. I mean, why wouldn't, if you marry the technologies, I really think, one of the most powerful ways to do something like this is what I'm seeing in a workflow that, we're using is for a client that's budget sensitive and they have a lot of translation memory. You can train an engine. So you've got the trained engine that comes from all the translation memory segments. You translate using the translation memory. So if we've translated the sentence before, why do I need a large language? I've already translated it. It's approved. It's especially that. If you have subject matter experts that approve context, you definitely want to keep version control. Why do you want to do it again? It's like someone already said this sentence is really good. Let's use that. Why am I going to want to rewrite it again, right? That doesn't make any sense. So you use the translation memory as version control. It pops in the sentences that have already been approved. What's left over, the material that's new or modified, then you can use the trained engine. You can use the trained engine to fill in the blanks, have a human review just that little uptick. And then if necessary, you could use an AI tool to measure the quality of the new segments. And I think that's like an amazing workflow. So, and that's a marriage of kind of all the buckets. And I like that.
And I think too, I think there's space to automate translation memory updates of like, okay, you as the translation provider, give the client your output. They do have someone review it and they're like, hey, here's what we changed. Dump that straight back into your large language model or your AI workflow and say, update the memory based on this. I know in the past it's been a relatively manual process of track changes and like go find this segment in the database and update it. But I think something kind of at the administration level of just, go find this, replace with that. That's something you could use AI for too. It's like, hey, go update my memory with here's the final translation that the client approved, as opposed to going back to a linguist and say, hey, go spend 3 hours hunting down these segments that they changed.
Absolutely. I think, there's a smart way to use the tech and to marry the tech. And I think that that's a better approach. I don't know that that approach will be the same in a couple of years. Maybe things change, but to me, it seems like the smartest way to do it.
I think too, something I hadn't really thought of before now, though, is not only language service providers using that, but freelance translators too, of like, you have your own translation memory of all the work you've done in the past. And I know it's a little weird or meta to kind of create your own custom GPT of yourself or something like that, but really leveraging your own translation memories in addition to the ones that translation providers give you when you work on a given project. I think you as a freelance translator can become that much more efficient. I know we always mention just how much more volume that translators are probably likely going to have to deal with the advent of all of these tools. So I think that's really a big differentiator, is not only quality will still be very important, but I think speed is becoming more and more important too.
Absolutely. I think and I'm obviously, we're going to revisit this in the podcast as things change, but that's a topic to watch for sure. Now, of course, all these things, right? All these different approaches, I think, play into service level choices. And I know that's something that we're going to focus on a great deal here at Argo Translation this year, is how do we show clients the different service levels and what they're getting? Because, this stuff it's kind of in the weeds, right, Patrick? I mean, if you're, a public relations person, or you're a marketing person, or even if you're a technical writer and you're not really from our industry, this stuff's a little bit in the weeds. And I can see our clients saying, well, how do I know which level to pick? I'm not really sure what I'm comfortable with or not comfortable with. And I think those of us that are in the industry need to help. I'm obviously always a big customer education person in terms of this stuff, because it's hard. There's a lot to this.
Yeah, I think what I'm kind of picturing is a helpful solution. So your marketing team can thank me later for this one, is kind of the like, picture when you're buying an airline ticket and there's like the 5 options of what ticket you can get for all the same seat. It's like extra legroom, exit row, the seat reclines. This one's right by the bathroom, so you have to deal with that the whole time. I think kind of listing those features of each level of service and, having a check mark or not is a really powerful visual and easy to digest for a buyer of like, okay, for this level of service, I get these 3 things, but if I pay 10% more, I get 8 things. So I'm going to go with that one. I know another one's like comparing wireless providers. That's always the example you see of like, with T-Mobile, you get this, with AT&T, you get that. And kind of just having that visual comparison is a really, really powerful way to get that customer education and get it fast. Cause I know that's always a struggle, is educating the marketplace takes a really long time. It takes a ton of content and all that stuff. So if you're able to distill it into like, go look at this one graphic that we have that can solve your problems a lot faster.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what we're working on, Patrick, is just a way that you can side by side compare what you're getting and what you're not getting, difference in cost, difference in speed, because speed is a thing too, right? So timelines. And that's going to be something we're definitely coming out with this year, which is good. So our listener also mentioned, kind of some specific use cases, and I do like looking at use cases, and with the remaining time, maybe we can look at that a little bit. Education. So we talked a little bit about that, and one of the things that I've seen, again, these are all business problems, right? And some of the business problems we're working on to solve are IEPs, right? So if we're looking at education and we're looking at schools, one of the big things that they do in translation are IEPs. And for those that don't know, that's basically a plan that if your child or the given student has some type of a learning challenge, federal requirements say you have to come up with a plan. How are you going to help this student learn and keep pace with their fellow students? And that might require more time on an exam, or different accommodations for homework and how they do things. And of course, obviously it changes as the child gets older. But now if you're dealing with an LEP or a family that has limited English proficiency, you have to communicate these things. It's rather complex. There's a lot to it. And to translate these plans is rather significant. And one of the things that we've been upset with as an agency that does a lot in that space is that a lot of that content is unreachable. And I get it, because it's IP, it's intellectual property, and it's in locked PDFs, and we have to scan and OCR and break and get these things formatted into a text file that we can use, so we can use our tools, because guess what? A lot of the content is boilerplate. So we would love to leverage more tools, but I'll tell you, that's been a stumbling block. So anyone that's listening from that space, I know we've had some conversations with some of you, so let's get rolling. Let's get this figured out. But where we've been able to help is chat, right? So that's the thing that we sort of took our Slack chat tool and said, hey, how can we help schools? And I think one of the things that we've been able to do is create some real-time translation opportunities. And what we've done inside of that Slack tool is we have the text recognition. So then if there's someone has a screenshot or something that a scan of a letter or something that came to them, we can recognize the text regardless of the language. The other thing we can do is prompts. So if for example, they have a parent that they're like through a chat tool or something like that, they can just cut and paste content in and get translations in real time, or attach it to a customer or parent facing channel, and they can do that. The other thing they can do is get audio prompts. So I just did an example on LinkedIn which said, hey, school is closed tomorrow due to inclement weather. Give me 6 prompts or 6 audio files, WAV files, that I could then take and put into our phone system, send into an email. So those are all things that we're doing, of course, along with our telephonic interpretation that helps. But we all need to move mountains to help our educators to do better, Patrick.
Yeah, I think you mentioned chat, and that takes me to customer support too. Just any business who's got a chat bot on their site. I think that's a ripe use for AI and AI workflows. I think that will help you to know who to route that issue to, who to escalate it to. If it's something your prompts can solve by itself, I think we'll continue to see chatbots kind of be that first line of defense, because it's cheap for companies to just dump a bot on there and say, hey, if you click these buttons rather than typing in inputs, we solve your problems a little bit faster. But I think a key there is to always have the button of like, give me a person, and have that out, as opposed to, I can't tell you, sorry Comcast, but every time I go to Xfinity and their chatbot, I like want to scream because it's so horrible. And I think most people deal with that with their internet providers. But I think having that option to get a person is the silver bullet there, because sometimes these tools do fail.
Absolutely. And, again, transitioning to customer support, like one of the things that's pretty cool is with some of these tools is this real-time chat translation and language detection. What I love that I see some of our customers are doing is saying, hey, we're going to be all human. This is what we're going to do. We're going to be all human. And it's going to allow us that, depending on time zones and such, I have customer service representatives in Argentina, helping people that have questions in Germany, and it really doesn't matter. So the German customer can type in German, all the Argentinian representative is seeing is Spanish, and when they type in Spanish, but all the German customer is seeing is German. And it's great because nobody's in the dark. One of the massive failures, and I'm not going to say who the tool is, but one of the massive failures and one of the big monster-sized tools that's out there in their chat is they just answer the question. They just use the help articles that they've indexed and the large language model to just answer the question. But here's the problem with that. So if I'm that Spanish-speaking agent and now the answer just spits out in German, well, I don't speak German. So I don't know what I just answered. So now you're putting words in my mouth. So that's a massive failure in that tool. And, I would, I know we've talked about, or I just did another LinkedIn video where I'm talking about translation as a feature. I mean, for the folks that are out there creating these features, dig a little deeper, figure out the use case fully, because that's a failure. Because now the Argentinian rep doesn't even know what they said. It's just so that's why I like, the solution that we're using is a lot better for that. So I'm biased, but there's that. How about HR, Patrick? What are you thinking about in HR in terms of some use cases there?
I mean, you tell me on this one. I've been out of the game for a bit here, so this one's all you.
So for me with HR, again, chat is great. I think there's, in larger multinational organizations where, they have employees in different places, chat translation is a good use there. Um, SharePoint knowledge bases, that's a good thing is when you're using a knowledge base and, maybe you provide service levels. So the authors can say, hey, this one's low risk. I'll use, MT with the human in the loop. We already have that service running in SharePoint, but there's no reason you couldn't attach something like that to Zendesk or pretty much anywhere where you're storing the Notion, a Notion knowledge base, you know, giving people the option to go up and down the service level chain helps them preserve budget dollars. We've also used the transcription tools to create transcripts of meetings that are in English but then need to be translated, provide subtitles and captions in multiple languages. So we've got some clients that do that in a completely low risk fashion where they're using more AI and just a human in the loop for review. So that's a big one for HR and manufacturing similar. The knowledge base example is a really, really good one there. Procedures and policies. Some of those are high risk and you still need to lean heavier into the humans, but that's what I love about at least what we're doing. And I know some of our competitors are doing as well, is sort of this melange of how you take some of these solutions and weave in human intervention because it needs the human intervention. Not always, but still most of the time. I can tell you for our group, when given the choice, most of our clients are still leaning heavily on human intervention in pretty much all of the jobs. So, I think just like that. Wow, we hit the mark on time, Patrick. What's your biggest takeaway of this discussion?
Yeah, I'm gonna cheat. I think the first one is more of a question, and the second one is a takeaway. I'm curious if you think we'll see something like what ChatGPT does at the very bottom. It's like, this was produced by AI. Like, AI can make mistakes, and some sort of disclaimer when there is an AI workflow involved. I would be curious to see who leans into that from the lens of transparency versus who just does it and doesn't say anything. I think that could be a very interesting differentiator. Um, but then something you said at the end there, I think that really stuck with me is um, I know we kind of joke that print media is dead, which I think is kind of tongue in cheek true. But I think leaning into those multimedia ways that you can get people access to the same information, like you said, a company meeting that's transcribed and then put in audio. I think just how the future generations consume content has largely shifted from print to audio or video or some sort of multimedia. And that gives you lots of different things you can play with. I can't think of how many times I get either an audio file or a voice memo from someone at work, and I go straight to play that on double speed because I need to know this thing faster. And I think reading a document is great, but if you can hear it spoken to you and you can speed it up and get that information that much faster, like that's only going to help you focus on your day job and get things done faster. So I think really leaning into those more media based types of workflows and translations and outputs that's not going away anytime soon. So I think if you can find a way to get those in the languages that your customers need, that's going to be gigantic.
So to answer your question, Patrick, about the citations and such, yes, I definitely think that that's where you're going to see a lot of focus. I think you're going to see a lot of focus on as well as like when someone does a workflow that they cite that, hey, we used a trained MT engine. This is your engine. It's private or not. This is a public engine that we're using for multiple customers. I think you're going to see that citation. We also used OpenAI to detect the text and the images. But again, that's you'll have to say whether you're using free or you're using a paid version that's private. Because again, remember most of these things, if you use them in a paid version, they're considered private and not the data is not used for retraining. So I think you're going to see those. I know we're already telling our clients that, hey, if you're using any of our automatic translation tools like the Slack one where you can upload a file, we tell them your first sentence should be, this file was generated using machine translation. There may be errors. Please use with caution. Just a simple statement like that will help your user understand that, oh, I got it. This was used with machine translation. So right away, it helps as well as if there is something odd in there and you're using this with automatic translation, that they give you a little bit of grace, right? So that's an important piece, I think, and a super simple step to get better output. For me, the biggest takeaway, and you touched a little bit on this, Patrick, is that this is a force multiplier, period. That AI, when used responsibly, and used effectively, is a force multiplier for not only us as an agency, as your language service provider, but you as a user in creating your content or doing whatever you're doing. So I think treating the tools with respect, using them when necessary, I can't stress that enough. To me, that's kind of my biggest takeaway. So with that, this episode of Translation Confidential is a wrap. Looking forward to seeing you next time.